Hello, everyone. My name is Gabby, and welcome to Masterclass by Open Up. Whether it's your first time joining or you have joined our masterclasses before, welcome. We've got a great presentation for you today. Open Up, as you might know, is on the path to make mental well-being accessible to all, and therefore every single month we organize these masterclasses with Open Up psychologists or external speakers so you can learn more about the tools and different topics that can contribute to your mental well-being. So before we jump into today's masterclass, I want to remind you that our masterclasses are interactive and live. Therefore, you can interact with each other and with our speaker through the chat, whether you want to share something or you can use the emoticons. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. So if you have a question that you want to ask, please feel free to put it in our questions tab. And then at the end, Jeroen will be answering your questions. Now, without further ado, the presentation today will be by Jeroen van Baar, who is an author, a researcher, a TEDx speaker, and he is going to be talking about success, achievement, and how it relates to happiness and well-being. See you in a second.
Yes, hi, thank you, Gabby. Thanks for welcoming me here. I'm very grateful to be here, invited by Open Up today to share my story and some of my thoughts with a larger audience today. So my name is Jeroen van Baar, and what I'd like to do today is share my personal experience with achievement anxiety, achievement pressure, and also share some science that might make us think a little bit differently about achievement. So my story starts a number of years ago when I went to a big career convention. I was a student at the time, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do after graduating. And so I went to this big convention called the Nationale Carrièrebeurs here in Holland. Some of you may know it. Actually, this reminds me, I'd like to find out where you're from. So maybe if you feel like it, just warm up in the chat and type the country that you're calling in from so I can get a quick idea. And then let me tell you about this career convention while we go. So I didn't know what I wanted to do for a job. And so what I did before going to this convention is to put on my suit, put on a red power tie that I'd bought specially for the occasion to impress recruiters, and print out my CV. And I had it under my arm, and I go to this convention center, and I walk in, and I'm just stunned by the sheer magnitude of this thing. There were hundreds of stalls of employers with recruiters for each company. And then per each recruiter, maybe 10 or 11 people, just like me, young, wearing their suit with their CV under their arm, trying to figure out what to do with their career. So I got a little bit scared. How will I stand out? How will I set myself apart to get the best result out of this day? Now, luckily, the people organizing the convention had blocked off a special section for people who had completed some sort of higher education, if you had a bachelor's or a master's degree. I had a bachelor's at the time, so I was allowed to go in, which meant that I got my name tag on a different color lanyard, blue instead of red. And I walked to this special section, and there was a bouncer there, a big guy who would look at your keyboard, and if it was blue, he would grunt, step aside, and let you enter into this kind of Valhalla of top companies. You know, the big multinational firms that we have in the Netherlands were there. And those were the firms that were seen as the top employers in that convention. Now, unfortunately, even in that special section, for each recruiter of a top employer, there were maybe 12 or 13 people just like me, wearing their suit with their CV under their arm and a blue keycord, trying to make a good impression. Now, luckily, a friend of mine had told me about this initiative called Best Graduates. How Best Graduates works, it's a website where you would upload your CV and your grade lists from your studies, and then they would analyze your profile. And if they thought, wow, that person is a real high potential, you would be allowed to enter the convention center through a special side entrance. You would get a golden keycord around your neck with your name tag, and you would be invited to do what they call the capacity test, kind of an IQ test, where you sit in this little back room with a laptop and you solve number lines or rotate figures in your head, kind of like an IQ test. And if you performed really well there, you had a chance of winning a wild card for a one-on-one conversation with a recruiter of a top employer. And now that you hear this story, you might have guessed it already. I did not get the wild card. And so I went home and sat on the train with my golden key cord. And I felt sorry for myself. I felt so disappointed. And then I started thinking, how is it possible that I got pretty far in this whole process, and yet I was feeling disappointed about myself? And how is it possible that I spent all day striving for the top on some generally assumed ladder of success with the top employers at the top, without having any idea what it would be like to work there, or if I would even enjoy that type of work? Well, I got home, tried to take my mind off of these things, so I opened the newspaper, and of course, that week, there were 3 big interviews with children who had achieved something amazing for their age. A 13-year-old boy was competing in So You Think You Can Dance on TV. A 14-year-old was doing MasterChef Kids, so he's really good at cooking. And a 12-year-old girl was writing her first book. So I threw away the newspaper, went on social media, and again, there I was bombarded with only the best experiences of my friends and family. Right? They had a fantastic new job or internship, or they were on this amazing vacation far away. And then it began to dawn on me that, at least in the Netherlands, we have this cliche that, just don't try to stand out, just be normal, be one of the crowd, then your life is good enough. But for my generation, and I think also the younger generation growing up now, Gen Z, this is not really true anymore. In fact, we are used to the idea that you can always excel at what you're doing, whether it's studying or working or cooking or dancing or even going on vacation. There is a way of comparing experiences and being a top achiever. And underlying this culture of achievement, this culture of performance pressure, is one key assumption, which is that more achievement will also lead to more happiness or a better quality of life. And I think it's interesting because I think there's actually some research in psychology that suggests that this assumption is not true at all. So let me share that with you. The first piece of evidence that I think is quite powerful actually comes from a TV show, one of my favorite TV shows of all time. And I'd like to hear from the audience if you have seen this show before. So just give a thumbs up if you recognize it. It's called My Super Sweet 16 on MTV. All right, people who've seen this show, okay, some thumbs up. Nice. So you might recognize then what I'm about to say. Every episode of My Super Sweet 16, we follow a child, a 15-year-old in the United States, usually a girl, who's about to turn 16. And her parents think this is an amazing achievement, and so they want to give her a huge birthday party. And really, all systems are go. They hire a party planner, they rent out a huge ballroom, the girl gets to pick out a designer dress, and of course she gets to invite all her classmates to the party, except perhaps the not so popular ones. And then at the climax of this episode, around 9 p.m. at the party, we get the moment when the girl gets her gift, her birthday gift. Maybe some of you can guess what the birthday present is in My Super Sweet 16. Just type it in the chat. Let me know if you've seen this. Okay, so some people here are real connoisseurs of My Super Sweet 16. Indeed, the present is a car, because she's turning 16, which is the legal age for driving in the States. And so her parents are there on the sidewalk outside of the ballroom, beaming with pride next to a beautiful black BMW convertible with a big pink bow around it. And the girl in her designer dress sees this car and she bursts into tears because all she ever wanted was a white BMW. And, this is kind of funny to watch. There's some schadenfreude there. It's reality TV, but it's also a little bit sad, right? Because the fact that girl is disappointed in a car that's not exactly the right color that she wanted reflects the fact that she has been brought up in such wealth and luxury that it's become almost impossible for her to be satisfied with something that is not totally perfect. This is an example of what we call the hedonic treadmill effect, or hedonic adaptation in psychology. You can experience more and more amazing things, but at the same time, the bar by which you measure those things is also raised. And so you don't really move forward in terms of how satisfied or happy you are with what you experience. I think it's interesting to compare this kind of human experience with something at the micro level, something we've seen in the field of neuroscience when we look at brain recordings. So I've brought for you one scientific graph that I think is one of the most important ones in neuroscience from the last 30 years. So let's take a look. What we're looking at here is a figure from a study where they recorded neural activity from a monkey. And these monkeys live and work inside the laboratory. Whatever you think about this is how it happens. They sit in a chair with their head fixated, and they're looking at a screen where they see all kinds of experimental tasks. And at the same time, electrodes are recording neural activity from their brain. You should know that these monkeys usually work not for money, of course, but for some kind of reward, some appetitive reward, like a drop of juice into their mouth. And that's the case also with this experiment here. So what we're looking at is a recording from a neuron in the ventral tegmental area of the brain. That's a place where neurons are active that function with the neurotransmitter dopamine. You might have heard of dopamine in the context of the reward processing system in the brain, and indeed, that's part of the function of dopamine. And these neurons are also part of that system. And what you see, every row in this figure is a trial of this experiment. And at time point R, so time goes from left to right, at R, they give a reward to the monkey. In this case, a drop of juice into the mouth. And what you see in this neuron here is that right after the reward is given, there's an increase in activity. The neuron is firing, sending off signals, hey, we're experiencing something nice. Now, the researchers here are training this monkey, right? And over time, they teach the monkey that before the juice comes, they will turn on a light a couple of seconds before. So that's the second picture here. At the CS line, the conditioned stimulus, so to speak, the light goes on, and then a couple seconds later, the juice is delivered into the mouth of the monkey. And after this learning process has taken place, what you see in this neuron in the brain is that they fire not at the reward when the juice is given, but actually earlier on when the light comes on, because that's when the monkey knows to expect that the reward will come. And in the third picture here, we see what happens when we, play a trick on the monkey, which means that we show the light, but the drop of juice doesn't come. And what you see is, again, this increase in activity after the light, but a decrease in activity at the moment when the monkey was expecting to get some tasty juice into their mouth. And what I think is critical here is that if the learning hadn't taken place, if the monkey hadn't learned to expect the juice, that depression in dopamine activity wouldn't have existed either. There would just be the same flat line in activity. But because the expectation has been raised, not receiving what you expect to receive becomes disappointing. And that is reflected also in the activity of this neuron here. Now, this is not the only part of the reward system, right? We don't have time to go into everything, but I think it's interesting how this, symbolizes or reflects this larger experience that we have as humans, where our expectations are really important for how happy we are with what we get. And that's also reflected in this photo, for instance. This went viral, became a meme in 2012. It's a picture of Michaela Moroni, an American gymnast, who won the silver medal in the London Olympics in 2012 on the vault, gymnastics. This was amazing because she was only 16 years old, incredible achievement, no matter what age you are, obviously. Olympic silver, right? Second best in the world for 4 years. But yet, when she was on the podium receiving her medal, this was her facial expression. She was not impressed, as was the name of the meme. Why? Because next to her was somebody just a little bit higher up with a gold medal around her neck. Moroni expected to win. She fell in one of the final rounds, and so she got silver instead of gold, and this was her expression. This is not just the only example. Psychologists have painstakingly coded pictures of medal winners in the Olympics, and what they found is that actually, on average, people winning bronze look happier than people winning silver. And that's surprising, right? Because we all know silver is better than bronze, and yet people who win bronze are happier, perhaps because they compare their experience with all the other athletes who didn't get any medal at all. This study was recently repeated with artificial intelligence, where they had a computer analyze the facial expression of medal winners in thousands of photos. And here's the result. The people who win bronze are significantly more likely to have a smile in their face than people who win silver. So I think this illustrates what one blogger on the internet summarized as follows. Happiness is reality minus expectations. How we feel doesn't just depend on what we experience, but also how we interpret that experience, and especially what we expected from it. And I think in our modern society, we've become very good at creating a really nice reality, safe, secure, with better healthcare than ever before. We live longer than ever before. But at the same time, our expectations have also gone up. And I think that makes it hard sometimes to be happy with the achievements that we get. So what I want to do now is go through a few psychological processes that can explain why our expectations go up in the world that we live in. The first of those mechanisms is what we call choice overload. This is the experience you might have in the supermarket when there's just too many types of, olive oil or something to choose from that you really can't make up your mind. And this doesn't just apply to consumer decisions like this one, but also to bigger choices in our lives, right? Where you want to live, what you want to study, what kind of job you want to have, who you want to spend time with. These are things that maybe 50 or 100 years ago were much more constrained, and now we have more freedom. And I want to be clear here, freedom is a good thing, right? But we also know from psychological research that in some cases, a bit of choice is better than no choice at all, but too much choice can be overwhelming and can actually make it harder to make a decision and make us less happy with the one that we actually choose. And to drive home that point, I brought a video for you of a psychology researcher called Barry Schwartz, who has a really nice TED talk on this kind of paradox of choice, when more choice can be less nice for you. So let's listen to what happens to Barry when he goes to the store to buy some jeans.
Third, escalation of expectations. This hit me when I went to replace my jeans. I wear jeans almost all the time, and there was a time when jeans came in one flavor, and you bought them, and they fit like crap, and they were incredibly uncomfortable, and if you wore them long enough and washed them enough times, they started to feel okay. So I went to replace my jeans after years and years of wearing these old ones, and I said, I want a pair of jeans, here's my size, and the shopkeeper said, do you want slim fit, easy fit, relaxed fit? You want button fly or zipper fly? You want stone washed or acid washed? Do you want them distressed? Do you want boot cut? Do you want tapered? Blah, 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 on and on. He went, my jaw dropped, and after I recovered, I said, I want the kind that used to be the only kind. He had no idea what that was. So I spent an hour trying on all these damn jeans, and I walked out of the store, truth, with the best fitting jeans I had ever had. I did better. All this choice made it possible for me to do better. But I felt worse. Why? I wrote a whole book to try to explain this to myself. The reason is... The reason I felt worse is that with all of these options available, my expectations about how good a pair of jeans should be went up. I had I had no particular expectations when they only came in one flavor. When they came in 100 flavors, damn it, one of them should have been perfect. And what I got was good, but it wasn't perfect. And so I compared what I got to what I expected, and what I got was disappointing in comparison to what I expected. Adding options to people's lives can't help but increase the expectations people have about how good those options will be. And what that's going to produce is less satisfaction with results, even when they're good results. Nobody in the world of marketing knows this. Because if they did, you wouldn't all know what this was about. The truth is more like this. The reason that everything was better back when everything was worse is that when everything was worse, it was actually possible for people to have experiences that were a pleasant surprise. Nowadays, the world we live in, we affluent, industrialized citizens, with perfection, the expectation, the best you can ever hope for is that stuff is as good as you expect it to be. You will never be pleasantly surprised because your expectations, my expectations, have gone through the roof. The secret to happiness, this is what you all came for. The secret to happiness is Low expectations.
Yeah, the secret to happiness is low expectations. Of course, that's a strong statement, but I think he drives home an interesting point that our expectations are really important for how happy we are with our own achievements. Now, luckily, psychologists, including Barry Schwartz, have identified different strategies for dealing with a situation in which you have a lot of options to choose from. There are two strategies that I want to share with you. The first one is called maximizing, and it's pretty simple. It makes sense. It means that in case you need a sweatshirt, for instance, you go to the store, you pick out the ones they have from the rack, you line them up, and you pick the very best one. In this case, obviously, the sweatshirt with the cats on it, right? The alternative strategy is interesting. It's called satisficing, and it means that you evaluate options until you find one that's good enough for you, that exceeds a certain threshold of quality. Then you take that sweatshirt, you go to the register, you pay, you throw away the receipt, you put on your sweatshirt, you go home, and you never think about it again. The interesting part of that second strategy is that actually you don't get to see all the options that are in the store, right? So it could well be that your favorite sweatshirt, the one with the cats, you haven't even seen it, and yet you've made a decision, and so you end up choosing something that's slightly suboptimal. But what researchers find is that actually, although your decisions are objectively perhaps a little bit worse, subjectively, people feel better with the decision-making process if they satisfice. And it also helps you, reduce the amount of cognitive load that you need to actually make that choice. So before we continue, let's do a little survey with the audience here today. In the form of a poll, I've brought 3 items from a questionnaire that researchers use to estimate whether you are more on the maximizing or the satisficing end of the spectrum. So let's look at item number 1. Are you a maximizer? When I'm in the car listening to the radio, I often check other stations to see if something better is playing, even if I'm relatively satisfied with what I'm listening to. Do you agree, disagree, or neither agree nor disagree? Are you the kind of person who sits in the car and keeps pressing next until you've heard all the stations, just to make sure that the song that you got was actually the best one? Okay, so I see kind of a split in the audience. Some people agree, some disagree, and of course, it makes sense. There are individual differences with how we make this kind of decision. Let's do item number 2. No matter how satisfied I am with my job, it's only right for me to be on the lookout for better opportunities. Do you agree or disagree? Do you like to reevaluate where you are, or are you the kind of person who's happy where they are and doesn't think about it too much? Agree, disagree, or somewhere in the middle. And here it's almost the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split. Exactly down the middle. But again, some interesting individual differences. Let's go to the last item. Let's see what you think of this one. Picking movies on Netflix is really difficult. I'm always struggling to pick the best thing to watch. Now, I have to be honest here. The original version of this questionnaire said renting videos from a video store. That's, the time we're speaking of here. But in this case, Netflix applies as well. Okay, we get a lot of agrees on this one. And I have to say that I also recognize this in my own experience. In part because the Netflix interface is never ending, right? There's always more. If you scroll down, there's always other options. And within that huge context of decisions, no one movie seems perfect or good enough for you. Okay, so let's see. This is not a fully fledged psychological study that you've just participated in. It's just to give you an illustration of different kinds of decision making. And researchers, among whom Barry Schwartz, have claimed that this type of decision making is actually related to outcomes in your life, not just when it comes to sweatshirts in the store, but even to picking your first job. They followed a cohort of students that were about to graduate. And at the beginning of that year, they gave them this questionnaire that I just showed you a couple of items from. And they divided the class into maximizers and satisficers. And then they tracked how they were doing in their job applications. And they found out that the maximizers had more job interviews, made it further in the process of interviewing at a given company. And in fact, in the first job that they got, or that they started at the end of the college year, they made significantly more money than the satisficers. It's a couple $1,000s, or I've converted it to euros here, per year. But they also discovered that during that decision-making process, the maximizers more often reported negative feelings, like worry, am I doing the right things, or guilt for not acting on some opportunities they'd received. And who do you think was more satisfied with the job that they got after college? Indeed, that was the satisficers. The difference is small, but it's significant. You can look it up in the article if you want to. So just to illustrate that the way we make decisions can actually have an impact, or it seems like it, at least from this data, on how satisfied we are with how we choose. And some of the reasons for this are that maximizers tend to evaluate what they've chosen more. They feel more responsibility for making the perfect choice. And so it can get very difficult to pick your favorite one out of a large array of options. Okay, let me move on to a second process that is active when when our expectations go up. And this has to do with knowledge of all the things that you could theoretically achieve. I brought a picture of King Charles here because the philosopher Alain de Botton makes a really interesting point about the royal house in England. He says, back then he was writing about the Queen, but let's translate it to the present day. He says, nobody in their right mind would be jealous of the King of England. He's very wealthy, and we might want more wealth for ourselves. And yet we don't seem to envy this person. And he says that this is because we don't actually compare ourselves to him because he's so different. He's in a very strange position. It's a position you can't aspire to. You have to be born into it. And so, we have less social comparison with somebody who's the King of England. And then he goes on to claim that in our Western societies, that kind of boundary between you and other people, where some people are just in a different societal track than you, has seemed to all but disappear. In fact, we tend to believe that you can achieve almost everything you want as long as you try hard enough. And this is also the message given on TV, right? For instance, in these talent shows like Britain's Got Talent on the picture here, the whole premise of the show is that people who are just like you and me, the girl or boy next door, can overnight become a big star and have an amazing life. This happened, for instance, to Paul Potts, who participated a couple years ago. He was a mobile phone salesman who loved to sing opera. And he turned out to have an amazing voice. And so he came in quite shy. And then at the end of the show, he was the finalist and even the winner of this whole season. And the judge, Amanda, who's sitting in the middle here, she told him on the day of the audition, we have a situation here of a lump of coal that's about to turn into a diamond. And that message, that anyone who is just normal can turn into a diamond if they just try or explore their talents, is something that we've grown up with, and that it really impacts what we expect from ourselves and who we compare ourselves to. And that social comparison is even fueled more by social media, right? Most people spend a lot of time on social media, sometimes hours per day. And on social media, we are again exposed to people that look just like us, and so we can connect with them, but they have a really cool or amazing life. Sometimes because they're popular on social media, their life becomes amazing, right? They become influencers and they get paid for it. And so they show what their life is like, and we can't help but let that influence the norms that we have for what life should be like and what we compare ourselves to. Now, I just want to show you a little bit of evidence for something you probably already know, which is that the world we see on social media is not the real world. This is a fun example from a student called Zilla van den Born who traveled to Thailand in 2014. And so she had photos of her trip to Thailand on her social media. She went to Buddhist temples and went to the beach and pictures herself snorkeling and so on. And then a few weeks into her trip, she suddenly appeared on her parents' doorstep in Holland. She rang the doorbell and they opened up and she said, "Mom, Dad, I never left." For weeks, she had been holed up in her boyfriend's apartment and had been using photos of the internet, taking photos of herself and photoshopping those into the picture and putting those on social media. And people totally bought it, right? They liked it, they commented, they even felt a little bit jealous of her. But with this experiment, she showed that that world on social media doesn't have to be real. And she didn't do this just to gain attention. This was her thesis project from a school of the arts here in Holland. I think she made a really powerful point about social media. All right, I want to give you one more example of a psychological mechanism that impacts what we expect from our experiences. And again, let's stay within the photography theme here. It's an interesting study that was done at Harvard, where students were offered the chance to participate in a photography class for free. And at the end of this week of photography training, they were allowed to pick 2 of their favorite photos that would be printed out big on a nice, beautiful photo print. And then the students were told, one of these prints you get to take home, and one of the prints will be sent to the headquarters of the course in London, super far away, which of course didn't exist, but that was part of the idea of the experiment. Now, half the students were told, you choose your photo now, the one you want to take home, and in a week or so, we send the other photos back to London. So if within a week's time you change your mind, and we'll call you to ask if this happened or not, you can still exchange the photos. You can give the one that you took to us, and you'll get the other one to hang up in your home. So they made a reversible decision. The other half of the group was told, you take your photo home now, and the other one will be sent with the first plane to London. It'll end up in the safe, and you'll never see it again. So that group made an irreversible decision. And the researchers wanted to know what the effect of the structure of the choice, reversible or not, would be on how satisfied people were with the photo they chose. And surprisingly, what they found is that people who could go back on their decision and optimize their choice in that way actually were less happy with the photo they chose, even if they didn't end up changing the photo. And so the researchers concluded that, if you're able to go back on your decision, what that leads to is a process of evaluation, even after you've made the choice. And that allows you to see more negative sides of the print that you chose. And so not having the option to reverse your decision can actually be beneficial for how happy you are with what you get. I think this is interesting because it might say something about how we deal with decisions in our daily lives, where actually we tend to choose things that we can go back on, like booking a hotel. It's nice to have the option to cancel it last minute if you want to. Or even when it comes to relationships, where we have a longer period of flexibility than in the past. Maybe that's something for the Q&A to talk about. Last detail about this study is that the researchers also asked a new group of students, in case you took this course, would you like to have the option to send your print back and exchange it for the other one? And the vast majority of people say, yes, I would like to make a reversible decision because I think that will make me happier in the long run. And so we don't always know what choice structure makes us happiest in the end. And sometimes not being able to go back is the best thing to do. All right, so to bring it back to this statement here that we saw before, happiness depends on what you experience, but also on the expectations that you have for yourself, whether it's about achievements at work or your vacation and sharing that on social media. So what does this mean for us? What can we do with all this knowledge? We know our expectations go through the roof. How can we stop this? Well, I'm not saying we should just not be motivated for anything anymore. I'm not saying we have to become couch potatoes like this beautiful picture that I made with Dolly the other day. Instead, what we should do, I think, is think about where our motivation comes from, our motivation to achieve things. Because psychologists have identified 2 different forms of motivation. The first kind is what we call intrinsic motivation, and that means doing something because you enjoy it or because you find it important in and of itself. And the other type is extrinsic motivation, doing something because you get rewarded for it, or perhaps because if you don't do it, you get punished. Those are 2 kinds of motivations. They're both valuable in their own right, but they can also conflict with each other. And researchers started to figure this out in the 70s when they did an experiment with children in an elementary school. And these kids, or I think kindergarten is the right word, these kids were told, here are some paper and some pencils, make a nice drawing. Half the group, that was the only message. The other half of the group was told, if you make a beautiful drawing, you'll get rewarded. You get a sticker, or you get to play with a toy that all these kids loved. And on the day itself, the researchers didn't really notice any differences. But when they came back later, they noticed that the kids who had been rewarded for making a drawing were spending less time drawing of their own accord than the other kids who had never gotten the reward. This was quite surprising because if you reason from the perspective of behaviorism, which was really popular in the middle of the 20th century, adding a reward for something should raise your motivation because you start to associate the activity with that good feeling of getting the reward. But here they found the opposite effect. And the researchers interpreted this as a over-justification effect, so to speak. So if kids already have an intrinsic motivation to draw, adding an extrinsic motivation, a reward, can actually harm that intrinsic motivation that existed before. And that means that when the reward is gone, kids don't come back to that activity as easily as before. And I think this is interesting when we think about, how we look at motivation in the workplace, for instance. Many people in the business world might receive a bonus at the end of the year, which is thought to motivate them for hard work. But I fear that over time, a bonus can actually, wear off or erode the intrinsic motivation that you had when you started the job. Something to consider. This also means that, if we want to free ourselves from the performance pressure, which is really on the extrinsic side, performing in terms of a measurable performance, comparing yourself to others, it might help to switch our attention to the intrinsic motivation side. So let's take a look at how we can do that. But first, to illustrate this point, I brought a video. Let me first tell you about intrinsic motivation, and then we go to the video. Researchers have identified 3 pillars of this type of motivation. The first is competence. So the feeling of being good at something can contribute to intrinsic motivation. The second is autonomy, having some freedom in how you organize your work. And the third one is relatedness, feeling like your work contributes to a goal that's greater than just yourself, or feeling that you relate to other people and what they need in your work. And if these 3 elements are present, under those conditions, it's thought that intrinsic motivation can grow and flourish, and that will drive you and help you resist the pressures of extrinsic motivation. So now let's go to a video of Barack Obama, who communicates a similar point to the interns in the White House a given year that he worked there. So let's take a look.
Worry less about what you want to be and think more about what you want to do. Because this town is full of people who want to be a congressman, or want to be a senator, or want to be a president. And if that's your focus, if that's your moral compass, then you're consistently going to be making decisions solely on the basis of how do I get for me what I want. If you think in terms of what do I want to do, I want to solve climate change, or I want to employ disadvantaged youth, or I want to fix a broken healthcare system, then even if you don't get to the place you want to be, the office you want, during that entire time, you're going to be working on stuff that's real and getting stuff done. And you'll be able to wake up in the morning and say, okay, well, I didn't end up being a congressman, but I ended up running this non-for-profit, and I'm still responsible for getting this done because I pressured the congressman to do it. Right?
Yeah, so what Obama says makes sense, right? Worry less about who you want to be and more about what you want to do. So he's basically reiterating this point, like don't think too much about the rewards or the status you get from your work, and think more about the joy or the value of doing the activity in and of itself. And then you'll find that it matters less where you end up, if you get that promotion, how much money you make, and so on. That's the idea. And another way of phrasing that is illustrated in this comic that I brought for you. I just want to see if you find it equally funny as I do. So we have 2 types of personalities here. You might have heard of this idea, type A, type B. It's a very simplified model, but the idea is that type A is like a go-getter, always rushing to work hard, and type B is more relaxed, taking it easy and enjoying day-to-day life. So type B says to type A, whoa, 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 slow down, friend. Don't you know that sometimes you have to stop and smell the flowers? And type A says, give me all the flowers. I'm the flower-smelling champion. This illustrates how even the enjoyment of an activity can turn into the subject of competition if we let it. And there are even some job applications these days where you have to, describe in your letter what makes you a very passionate person. So the passion, the enjoyment of the activity in itself, the intrinsic motivation, becomes the topic of comparison and extrinsic motivation. So I think we have to be careful of this and really, try not to focus on competition with others, but to really focus on what we enjoy in our work in and of itself. And I think in the long run, that will lead to more sustainable motivation, more enjoyment, happiness, and also probably better results, because intrinsic motivation allows you to be more creative and relaxed in what you do. So if you want to figure out for yourself where that intrinsic motivation lies, one way to start, and I'm not saying this will work for everyone, but one way to start might be to just fill in those circles for yourself: competence, autonomy, relatedness. What parts of your job or your ideal job would allow you to relate or connect with what you're good at, your competence? In what way do you experience autonomy? And in what way do you experience relatedness to a higher purpose or other people? And in that little middle segment of the figure where the circles overlap, those are the activities where you might feel most intrinsically motivated, according to the researchers I mentioned before. All right, that's the last bit of science I wanted to share with you. If you read Dutch, more can be found in my book, De Prestatiegeneratie, or in my TED Talk on YouTube. And for now, thank you very much, and we'll go into the Q&A.
Thank you, Jeroen, for a really great presentation. I particularly enjoyed the comic that you showed about type A and type B. I think a lot of people can relate. So before we dive into the questions, I had a quick question myself. Are you a type A person or a type B person?
Yeah, it's a very funny comic. I really like this Shen Comics artist as well. I think I'm more of a type A, unfortunately. So, it can be hard for me on a busy day to stop and smell the flowers. Which is why I think I'm also, vulnerable to this kind of achievement anxiety or pressure. Yeah.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
And we also got a question from Claudio. In which cases is extrinsic motivation more effective than intrinsic motivation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, I'm not trying to say that extrinsic motivation is always bad. I think there are, plenty of things that just need to be done and that you might not love. Another example is, in elementary school, when children are still growing up and still discovering their interests, there's also things they just have to learn, like how to spell and how to do math. And those are things that with intrinsic motivation alone at that age might be difficult. So then setting clear goals and rewarding kids for reaching them is totally fine and helpful. But I think as adults, if you figure out why you want to do what you do and why you're enjoying the work that you're doing, that can be a sustainable motivation in and of itself, and that's enough. And in fact, it's more sustainable than extrinsic motivation.
And I'm curious, how does it work then? Because, I think a lot of people thinking about motivation at like New Year's. I'm gonna exercise more, I'm gonna eat healthier. I think initially maybe that's like intrinsic because they really want to do the change. But then you see that, right, like maybe by like February, a lot of people have not continued with their like resolutions.
Right.
And is there maybe a balance, or how it works when intrinsic motivation maybe then becomes more of like a habit, or how it changes? Because I think, of course, it's harder to sustain intrinsic motivation, correct?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think if intrinsic motivation is almost effortless. Like if I enjoy playing the guitar, for instance, I don't need any reward to do that because it's just fun in and of itself. I do have the experience though with the New Year's resolutions that you make them and then it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I think actually, that some people have given advice like Dan Ariely, a psychologist, has written a blog about this once, where he's like, there are tricks to make you stick to your resolutions. For instance, pre-commitment and social control are really effective. So if you agree with a friend to go to the gym every Saturday, then you'll probably do it more often than if you would only be by yourself, because you don't want to disappoint your friend and you've pre-committed to it. But I still think that it's going to be more effective if your New Year's resolution is centered around something that you value intrinsically. For instance, I want to feel good in my body, or I want to feel healthy, or I want to be kind to myself or treat myself well. If that's your motivation and you can connect to that, and then on that motivation, go to the gym, or maybe on other days, if you can't go to the gym, you find a way to put in a long walk, for instance, then it's actually more flexible, because it doesn't exactly matter what the outcome is, because it's more about the motivation and the process. And there's many different ways in which you can satisfy that motivation. Just like Obama said, it doesn't matter where you end up, it's about what you're working on. And the same is true, I think, for New Year's resolutions. So my advice would be to frame them as something you value instead of framing them as something that you do.
Indeed. The framing definitely changes how you might feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Kali. How can we reduce the tendency for social comparison?
Yeah, so they're asking about social comparison, which is this feeling of measuring your own achievements and performance by the standards that other people set, right? This is something I think many people recognize, especially with social media. You look on your phone and you're just confronted with all the other things you could have been doing. It's like FOMO, fear of missing out, is part of that as well. I think, again, this comes back to, how you think about valuing your life experiences. It's very easy to get distracted by the flashy things that other people are doing. And I think the only antidote is to come back to finding your own way to figure out what you find important in life and what you want to spend your time doing. If you figure that out and can be happy with that, then you might not feel so triggered by looking at the amazing achievements of others. You might be able to be happy for them instead of experiencing it as a threat or a judgment of some kind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just saw a question that I think is a great one as relates to this. Is being type A or type B a choice? Or is this something that you're born and you're this type of person?
It's not founded on any research, right? Type A, type B. Yeah. This is not a scientific construct. It's more of a model for it helps us talk about individual differences between people. There are differences in personality traits like conscientiousness that might relate to this idea. I think those traits are, our personality is to some degree fixed. It's quite stable. If you measure somebody now and in 6 months, there will be a pretty strong correlation between those measurements over time. So in that sense, it's stable. But you can, of course, learn to be, to respond more flexibly and to maybe, learn to not respond in your impulsive way to a new situation, especially if it's a situation where it might not matter so much what you achieve and you just want to enjoy it. So I think personality is pretty stable, but we can also learn to be flexible. Yeah. For sure.
I saw just a question from Vanya. Can you train to be a type B person, or more like of a satisficer versus a maximizer? I guess it takes a lot of effort too. Maybe it's like first, whether it's like discipline or having I think what helps me is like little post-its, to kind of remind yourself, oh, I'm trying to maybe, change my behavior or respond a different way.
Well, this is just speculating, but we're also talking about like, are you focusing on where you currently are and what you're doing right now? Or are you already thinking about the next thing that you need to achieve? Or the thing you have to tick off your to-do list after this? And that can, it can be very stressful to constantly think about the next thing. And so training yourself to be in the moment, for instance, through mindfulness, this is a part of mindfulness meditation, might help you smell the flowers a bit more. But this is just speculating. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and not try to go for that competition of winning.
Yeah, and then on top of that, it's also, what I find when I talk to people about these topics is that some people say, well, I'm a maximizer when it comes to my clothing because I really care about it, but I'm a satisficer when it comes to Netflix. I really don't mind. Right? So there's different domains, and if you really care about something, you might even enjoy really optimizing it as a maximizer if it's your hobby. And that shows that indeed it is possible. Like you're not tied to this method of decision making. It's more like, there are different ways of approaching a problem. Maybe you can, next time you choose something, try the other one.
Nice approach. Let's see, we got quite a few questions. I see a question from Sina. How can we get out of the achievement loop? But I guess it probably also relates to just different areas and seeing what's important for you.
Yeah, well, it makes me think of that hedonic treadmill, right? To me, this comes back to the idea of framing. It's like, are you framing, let's talk about work for a second. Are you framing your work in terms of, reaching measurable goals that you set for yourself, like a promotion or a raise or something like that? Or are you framing it in terms of competition with your peers? Versus, are you framing it in terms of getting better at the job or achieving more autonomy or feeling more related to goals that are important to you when you work? And I think if we are able to switch our attention to that second set of focal points, then that'll allow us to not be as distracted by the next achievement that's always, behind the next turn, so to speak.
Kind of like chasing the carrot that you're never gonna.
You're never gonna get there because it's not gonna feel. Even if you get rewarded, like we know from research, for instance, that an unexpected reward is more motivating than an expected reward. If you can see it coming, it doesn't actually do as much for you. So I think, when we talk about work and income, it's important not to have too little income. That's a bad thing because people feel stressed that they're not going to, make the end of the month without being strapped for cash. That's a bad thing, and that ruins motivation and can also have a negative impact on your mental health, right? So making enough money is important. But once you make enough money to have a reasonable quality of life and you don't have to worry about it, then getting more money in the form of a bonus or whatever isn't going to motivate you more, isn't going to make you that much happier either. So then it becomes really important to think about what drives me intrinsically in this job and what do I want to achieve. And then if you do that and enjoy the process of getting better at what you're doing, the proceeds will come, so to speak, right? But almost more as a side effect than as the goal that you set for yourself.
I remember seeing this study, I don't remember from what year, but it showed a difference. For example, if you make like $40,000 a year and then increase to 75, that like the increase in happiness was greater. But if you go from like 75 to 100,000 to more, then it's like much less, because what you're saying is like once you're able to kind of meet your basic needs, right, and then you feel more comfortable and you have some money, it's not like a source of stress anymore. So then kind of like the bar raises, but you also don't have such a huge difference in happiness.
Right, the marginal effect of making more decreases, and there's almost like a plateau there. I did see recently that there's a new study that that questions this finding, because what they did is, normally they give people a questionnaire. How happy are you? How much money do you make? And they correlate it with each other. In this study, they gave people momentary measurements, which means you get a buzz on your phone. And then in that moment, you have to rate how happy you are. And in that study, they did find that moment to moment, wealthier people are happier than less wealthy people. I don't know what these wealthy people are doing that makes them so happy. But so this is just like a side note with the type of measurement. But I do think that if not a plateau, there is definitely a reduction in slope. So, more and more money isn't going to buy you the same amount of increased happiness. Definitely not.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And on the topic of work, I saw actually a really interesting question from Elizabeth. How do you think businesses can help employees to redefine achievements and reduce performance pressure?
Yeah, so I think, some businesses are doing this already. They're focusing, for instance, on the autonomy aspect of intrinsic motivation by saying, every Friday afternoon, you can work on whatever you want. You don't have to bill your hours to a project or justify what you're doing. It's free time to play and experiment. And some companies have found historically that kind of freedom actually leads to innovation that is better for the company as a whole in the long run. And at the same time, it can help you build your intrinsic motivation and be less obsessed with achievement. I also think, like I said before, being critical of bonus structures can be interesting. I'm not exactly an expert on this, so I can't say what you ought to do or oughtn't do, but it's definitely something to think about. And the final one that's always been important for me as a researcher is like in academic research, the feedback loop is really long. So you're working on something and it takes years to see a result, right? So it's easy to forget what you're working towards. And so for me, reminding myself of what that end goal is, and working with your team to remind each other why you're excited about this topic, that can be really beneficial in sustaining your motivation over time.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining our masterclass, and thank you for a really interesting presentation.
You're welcome.
If you do speak Dutch, I do highly invite you to get Jeroen's book. And yes, thank you very much. And thank you everyone. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you in the next masterclass.